Good morning, everyone. It's noon, and so happy to get started. I'm Robert Stiles with Telehealth ROCKS. Wanted to pass off to Melissa Maris, who will do the introductions and get us started today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robert. And hello, everyone, and happy Tuesday. If you haven't already, please take a chance to introduce yourself in the chat. And we just have a few housekeeping items to walk through. We're so glad you're here today for the next session of our Keeping Kids Safe Echo. Today, we're going to be talking about suicide safety planning and working with parents. Telehealth ROCKS is a federally funded program that focuses on school-based behavioral health. We do this by working on social determinants, supporting school-based services, and telementoring trainings like this one here today. In terms of just a little bit of housekeeping, this session is being recorded and we will share it with you afterwards. Your microphone has been muted. Please feel free to unmute or use the chat at any time. I will be facilitating in the chat. I should have started by introducing myself. I'm Melissa Maris. I'm a consultant with the Telehealth ROCKS team. I'm a clinical community psychologist, physically located in Columbia, Missouri. So after the session today, your completion certificates will be mailed actually after the series. If you can, please sign in with your first and last name so we can identify you and make sure that we get the information to you that we need. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I am pleased to introduce you all to Erica Mold, the program coordinator for Kansas Suicide Prevention Headquarters. We have loved partnering with Erica and team on this ECHOs, and Erica is here with us today. And again, I'll be monitoring the chat. Please feel free to post any questions you have, any thoughts, resources, ideas. You're also welcome to direct message me at any point if you have any questions or any needs that I can help with. And just a few other pieces. So in terms of disclosures, we do not have any to disclose. And in terms of research, we are always relying on the most recent updates from research and trying to offer content that is research-based. And again, after the session, we will send you the slides and the recording and also your certificates after the series is complete. So with that, Erica, hello and happy Tuesday. And I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So give me one second. Sorry, I needed to clear my throat. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about suicide safety planning, and then we're going to elaborate on our conversation from last week about working with parents. A lot of what I'm going to be, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. A lot of what I'm going to be pulling today, we'll skip this slide too, just for the sake of time. I've done that each week, so I think we're okay. I guess I could also introduce myself. I'm Erica Mold. I am the Zero Suicide Program Coordinator at Kansas Suicide Prevention HQ. So we've been happily collaborating on this Keeping Kids Safe Echo series. And we're just kind of continuing conversations from each week that's passed. So today I'm going to be pulling a lot of our information around safety planning from the Stanley and Brown safety planning template. You all will receive a template, like a handout of that in your email. I will also remind everyone that last week, if you were here, you received a template or a sample policy that has a lot of information about suicide intervention in schools. One of the sheets in that packet was a Stanley and Brown safety planning template that I adapted to include safety planning in the home environment and also in the school environment. So that's something that I would really encourage all of you to use in your schools if you don't already have a safety planning template that you're relying on. And if you need that to be recent, we can get that out to you all. So let's kind of start by talking about what a safety plan is and how it should look. A safety plan is considered a brief intervention. And it is a prioritize written list of coping strategies and resources or sources of support. Ideally, we want to be using a safety plan and have a safety plan already created before a crisis occurs, but that's not always possible. So it's totally okay to create a safety plan during a suicide or mental health crisis, but ideally, folks would have one already in place before one occurs. Safety plans should always be made collaboratively. It's really important that the person who the safety plan is for is involved in the creation of that safety plan. We have seen a lot of times where safety plans will be made and the helper is kind of putting down their own ideas for what they've heard works or what works for them. And there are times where some of the things that have been put on people's safety plans, that person that the safety plan is for doesn't even know what yoga is, for instance, or doesn't have the actual physical ability to engage in something like that. And so it's really important that safety plans are made collaboratively, and you'll get a lot more buy-in in terms of willingness to stay safe if you are including the person in the creation of that safety plan. Safety plans should always be brief and easy to read, and anyone can benefit from a safety plan. So I always tell everyone I have a safety plan in my phone. I use the Stanley and Brown safety planning app on my phone. And so if that's something that you all are interested in, I highly recommend downloading it, because then you always have your safety plan with you if you always have your phone with you. And I encourage the folks in my life to do the same thing. Even if they're not currently at risk of suicide, or if their suicide risk is low. So this is just an example of what that template looks like. It has six parts, and then at the very bottom it asks, what's one thing worth living for? We're not going to go through all of these parts because we just don't have that much time today, but we do offer training on safety planning. And if that's something that you're interested in, I would encourage everyone to kind of just check out our website, and I can put a link to that in the chat and before we end today. So today we're gonna pull from step 2, which is talking about internal coping strategies, and then we're gonna pull from step 3, which is talking about distractions. And then we're gonna look at those 2 steps within the context of the school setting or the school building. And then after that, we're gonna talk about safety planning with parents using step number 6, which is making the environment safe, and considering specific triggers, which isn't necessarily on this safety plan, because step 1 is talking about warning signs, which is thoughts, images, moods, situations, different behaviors, different things that might indicate to a person that a crisis is going to occur and that they might need to use their safety plan. And warning signs can often look different than these specific things that might happen. So we might hear a student say, if I fail this test, then I'm going to kill myself. Or, some variation of if then, right? So those specific triggers are things that we want to consider safety planning around as well. And we do want to involve parents in those plans. So when we think about step number 6, we're going to specifically think about how we can include parents and how we have to include parents in those plans, and how we have to think about safety at home primarily, but also safety at school. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So to talk about internal coping strategies, really what this means is this is referring to things like activities or just different things that can help someone feel calm or grateful or distracted that specifically does not require another person's involvement. So these are things that someone can do on their own silently most of the time. And sometimes we might be doing these things and nobody even knows that it's happening. So it's cool to sometimes that's not the case, right? Sometimes hobbies are very apparent, or we have fidgets and stuff like that that are a little bit more obvious. But they're things that we can do on our own that don't require another person. So some examples just in general our relaxation techniques. So if we can teach students relaxation techniques, if there are specific relaxation techniques that the student already knows or that they know work for them, those are things that we're going to want to put here. Specific hobbies, for me, playing basketball was always on my internal coping strategy. If I was having a hard day, I could go outside and shoot hoops. It was a helpful release for me. Other types of physical activity, other types of hobbies might include like coloring or some type of art and craft, those types of things. And then physical activity like exercise, going for a walk, going for a run, doing yoga, those kinds of things. So those are examples that are just more general, but not all of these lend themselves to the school environment, right? We're not always able to have access to these during a normal school day. And we don't want to be disruptive when we're thinking about internal coping strategies at school. So I would like to hear from you all. What are some of the creative things that you've come up with on safety plans for students that they can do during the school day that doesn't totally disrupt the school day? Particularly that doesn't disrupt other students, but that does allow the student to engage in some type of calming or distracting activity. So if you all want to unmute or type in the chat, I would really like to hear what are some of the things that you've either come up with already or you're thinking of right now that could go on someone's safety plan. Okay, so there's a recovery room. Could someone elaborate, Christina, if you want to, could you elaborate on what your recovery room kind of looks like what's in it? What are some ways that that room can be utilized?
Okay, sorry, I was eating.
Oh, no worries.
There's a couch in there. It's dark. You can turn the lights down or up. There's snacks in there, water. We check in with the kids when they go in there about every 10 minutes or so. They should really be down here for 10 minutes, but sometimes they stay longer, but we just check in with them. But it's just kind of a calm area for them to go and relax. There's a rocker in there, like we can go in and sit with them, but most times kids are on the couch. And
Okay.
There's fidgets in there. There's personal hygiene products in there. They just go in there and relax a little bit. And then there's a space for us to go in and talk with them.
Awesome. I like that you're kind of paying attention to basic needs too, snacks and water.
Mhm.
That's really smart
Yeah.
and really, really, really cool. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
So taking laps around the school, that's something that I used to do with kids when I was working at the community mental health center in the summer kids program. Is just like, oh, we're starting to get activated. Maybe we're overstimulated. Maybe we need to take a lap and kind of step away from the group for a minute. Fidget spinners, coloring books, crossword puzzles. I love that. Deep breathing. That's really good to be able to teach any students of any age. Some deep breathing techniques I think can go a really long way. Wow. Wow, that's a lot of walking for one school. That's pretty cool. And then centering, breathing techniques, and EFT tapping. Okay, cool. So those are some things that can go on a student safety plan. So, I mentioned that these things need to be created collaboratively, and that is absolutely true. That doesn't mean that as the person who's helping a student create a safety plan, it doesn't mean that we can't offer options or ideas, right? We can say things like, here's something that's coming to my mind. What do you think about this? Do you think that this would be helpful? Do you know what it is? Have you tried it? Should we try it right now? Those kinds of things can really get a student thinking, especially if someone's in a crisis and they're not necessarily thinking, they don't have their best thinking brain capability right now in a crisis. So we can definitely offer ideas and options as long as it really feels like to them it's going to be useful. That's what we want to write down, are the things that they feel like are going to be useful. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
I think, Erica, if I can
Oh.
pop in, one of the ways that I've also had some success with brainstorming around these kinds of coping strategies is just reflecting on what a young person already does
Yeah.
to cope and identifying it. And all of us have different coping strategies, right? We might not think of it that way. But the old school, take a walk around take a lap around the school. I mean, that's something that people have been doing for a really long time.
Mhm.
So, but making it explicit of why it works. And so, and that also can help kind of brainstorm, right? So I love the recovery room ideas, and just the idea of, okay, what can we change in terms of environment? Can we adjust the sensory experience? Can we make things softer or colder or warmer, or,
Yes.
basic needs or smooth? And so then that way it's recognizing existing strengths, but then also then making sure, kind of how you started, is those internal coping strategies that aren't going to take a lot of time and effort. They're not going to distract other students, but kind of brainstorming in that direction. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So then step 3, we're talking about people and places that can provide distraction. So some of the things that we mentioned already in the chat might also fit on step number 3. The point of this particular step is to think about places that you can go or people that you can talk to where you don't have to talk about your emotions. You don't have to talk about the crisis at hand or how you're feeling or what's going on. It's just purely for the purpose of distraction. So a lot of times people will put things on here like watch TV, listen to an audiobook, or read a book, listen to music, those types of things where their brain is just focused on something else. You might call a friend who isn't a particularly good listener, or just talk to a friend who's not a particularly good listener. So we give this example of like the one-upper. Like if you know that you have a friend, if you call them and you say, I'm having a bad day, then they'll say, oh, my day is really bad too. And then they'll kind of go into what's going on. Sometimes that can be a great distraction from your own stuff. Sometimes it's not particularly useful, and it's kind of just dependent on what it is, what kind of listener you need right now, right? So that's kind of how we talk to students about these particular parts of the safety plan. And then also a change in scenery. So in the outside of school, we think about like going to the library or going to a coffee shop or going to an arcade or something like that, or the grocery store, even when we're working with adults, like walking around Target, that can be a great distraction. So thinking about that, like that spirit of distraction, but then contextualizing it to the school building again. Are there any that you would add to the list that's kind of already up in the chat for this particular step? Some examples of distractions that you can encourage during the school day. The recovery room sounds like, I think that would probably go really well on here. Oh, that's smart. Yeah, simple basic tasks. Please take this thing to the front office. So yeah, really giving someone something to focus on, a task to do. I had never thought about that before. That's a really good idea. Yeah, so they can go visit a different classroom. Yeah, that's a good idea. I'm thinking about like when I was in elementary school and middle school, if I got my work done and I was bored, that would be a time for me to, start getting really chatty, and disruptive. And so often I would just ask my teacher, can I go help the kindergarten class? And that was a really helpful, just like task-oriented distraction that also gave me a change in environment. Any other ideas?
So my children are young, so 2nd and 4th grade. But one of the things that their school does, and it's not around safety planning necessarily, but more, if a young friend is experiencing really, really intense feelings, which is oftentimes kind of what is happening before we get to the place where we need a safety plan.
Mhm.
But it really is this combination of kind of distraction and, helping people develop distress tolerance.
Mhm.
So these are hard feelings, but they're not going to last forever. But one of the things that they do, and I think it can be translated, and I've seen it translated across grades, is they just have this special box of teacher supplies that you can't see inside of it, but it's really heavy. And so they'll ask a friend or maybe a couple friends to actually carry it to another classroom, or put it in the teacher's room. The secret is that there's actually nothing in the box. It's just like bricks, but they all think that there are like supplies in there that they're helping, but then also physically kind of like exerting kind of that force, taking some space, changing the scenery if they have to work with another friend, that's teamwork. So again, all of those things that are distraction, that if we can just, hang on for 10 minutes and do something in the meantime, that a lot of times the feelings become less intense. Similar thing of, can you help with sweeping or picking something, cleaning something up? It used to be, when I was in high school, it used to be, the guys like putting together the tables and folding that up and moving them across the cafeteria or whatever those things were. And I saw people using that strategically to help young friends calm down,
Yeah.
which is essentially what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So when we think about working with parents and guardians and families, we really, go ahead and go to the next slide. We really have to talk about access to lethal means. That's kind of the place that we need to start. We know that having these conversations can be really difficult for a lot of reasons. Talking about firearms in Kansas is just a hot button issue, right? It's important that we're armed with the information that we know to be true about firearms in youth, so that we can present that information to parents, and also so that we can be equipped to understand a child's access to firearms in particular. So we want to know how are the guns stored in the home, and we want to have information about every firearm, because if a family has a firearm, they probably have more than one, or they often have more than one. I don't want to say probably, but that's often the case. We want to know if their child has any access to the firearms in the home. And we want to know that from the parent's perspective and from the child's perspective. Because a lot of times parents actually underestimate what their child knows about what goes on in their home. So when we ask these questions, we want to ask the child, are there any firearms in your home and do you have access to them? We might ask a question like, how long would it take you to get access to a firearm in your home? Because that can give us a lot of really good information that then when the parents might say, no, yes, we have firearms, and no, the child doesn't know where they're at. Then we can say, actually, your child did disclose that they know where it is, and that it would take them less than 5 minutes to get access to that thing. So we want to know about that. We want to know if there are other homes where the child stays that might have guns. So if like the kid goes to grandparents' house after school, or a babysitter's house after school, depending on their age, a friend's house, are there firearms in those homes? We want to ask those questions. And then we want to make sure that when we're talking with parents about access to firearms initially, that we are having this conversation where the youth can't hear, because if the youth actually does not know about firearms in the home, we don't want them to know. So it's kind of just something to consider, is making sure that, especially if the youth is at risk of suicide, even if they've never talked about using a firearm as a plan for suicide, I want to make that I really want to emphasize that point. If they've never talked about using a firearm for suicide, we still always want to assess for access to firearms, because firearms are the most lethal means of suicide. It's something like 89%, I think. Yeah, 89% of intentional gunshot wounds are fatal. There's an inability to reverse the effects of a gunshot wound. And that looks different than like if someone were to attempt suicide by overdose. There's like a high possibility that those effects can be reversed. That's not true for a firearm. So it's really important that even if they've never talked about using a firearm, we are still asking about that, because youth are impulsive, and if something were to go wrong, if something were to happen, then it's really important that we know and that we do some safety planning around firearms in the home. So that's why we're focusing on firearms right now. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So when we're talking with families about firearms, we just want to approach this from an educational standpoint. We want to make sure that we are communicating to parents these particular points. Firearms are the most lethal method of suicide. Unlike nearly every other method of suicide, there's no opportunity for the person to change their mind or be rescued mid-attempt. So that's that reversibility or irreversibility thing that I was just talking about. Since suicidal feelings are often short-lived and can come on unpredictably, putting time and distance between an at-risk youth and firearms is an effective way to protect them. So this is the most crucial information that we want parents to know. Parents are going to ask, why are we talking about firearms? Why is this important? You are just trying to take my guns. You might hear some of that defensiveness come up. And so these are the reasons why we're having this conversation. And these are the things that we want to make sure that we are communicating to the parents. Let's go ahead and move on. I want to get to the scenarios. In all cases, working with parents around mental health crises, the necessary skill set is to first consider your own emotional reactions to parent responses and then work to regulate those. So there might be lots of emotional reactions on our part that come up when a parent maybe isn't taking something seriously, or is dismissing concerns, or is doing something that doesn't fit with what we would want, or that what we would hope for them to do. It's important that we are able to check ourselves and, yes, acknowledge our emotions, but also work from a place of compassion and validation. It almost feels sometimes manipulative to work from a place of compassion and validation when we're having an emotional reaction that's strong. But really, I like to think about it as this is the thing that serves you and the student best. So it's not actually manipulation. It's really just about getting the needs met, right? So it is manipulation, but it's like not in like a, what's the word? I'm sorry, like a malicious way. We're not doing this to hurt anyone. We are doing our best to kind of recognize, where is the parent coming from? How can I have compassion for whatever it is that they're experiencing, even if they're being really resistant? And how can I validate that this is really hard, that this is scary, that this is not an easy conversation to have? And how can I use that compassion and validation to my advantage to ultimately keep the student safe? That's what we're trying to do. So some examples of what that can look like. I'm going to move. Okay, some examples of what that can look like. Here, these are the next few slides are some really common things that we hear from parents. So you shouldn't have asked my student about suicide. You gave them the idea. Well, this is just one response, or actually two responses that you can kind of pull from and think about using in terms of responding to this type of statement from a parent. And so this is using compassion and validation to ultimately get the needs of the student, the safety needs of the student met. I know this must be a really scary time, since you may not have heard your student talk about suicide before. I've learned that it's really dangerous for students to have no support around suicidal thinking. It's important that we can work together to get the help that we need now. I know from my work with kids that asking about suicide doesn't give them any ideas, but talking with your student today has helped us both to know what we need to do next, which is to get help. That fear around, if I ask about suicide, it's going to give them the idea, is real. It's a really common myth around suicide in general. And so we want to validate that that's a really common fear. And then we want to make sure that we are giving the accurate information, which is that me asking directly about suicide does not give your student the idea to kill themselves. And there is a lot of research and evidence around that particular thing. Okay, let's go ahead. So depending on where you live, like I mentioned earlier, firearms are really important to specific communities. And a lot of Kansans feel really strongly about having access to firearms. And often in these communities, when it's important to a family to have access to firearms, a lot of times their kids know about gun safety. That is another important thing to them. And so like in a hunter safety course, for instance, we're going to talk about gun safety. There's lots of different examples of that. So when a parent might say, my child is safe, they know about gun safety, we can respond and say, it's so important that you focused on gun safety in your home. But when a person is struggling with thoughts of suicide, all of that knowledge usually goes out the window. That's why I want you to think about some ways to make sure the firearms in your home are stored safely. Can I share some of that information with you? It can be really hard to imagine that your firearm that's for protecting your family might be a threat to one of them. Let's see if we can work together to figure out some ways to keep everyone safe. So that's another thing that can come up for parents, is like, no, firearms are for protection. And it's hard for them to wrap their mind around the possibility that a firearm could be used for harm, as opposed to used for protection. So even though sometimes, at least for me, I'll just speak for myself, I get really heated when a parent isn't hearing me, or when I'm trying to talk about firearm safety, specifically around suicide. But it's helpful for me to be able to understand the parent's perspective and bring in some of that compassion when I'm angry. Does that make sense? Like being able to understand, like, oh, it's actually really hard for you to wrap your head around this possibility, that your firearm that you have for protection could be used to harm your child. That's not something you might have ever considered before. And I can have compassion for that. That's really scary. So those kinds of things. Or when parents are like, no, I did my part. I taught my child about gun safety, so they're not going to use it to kill themselves. Well, when they're in a crisis, that information's not going to register for them. That information about safety isn't going to matter. So let's go ahead and talk about some other ways that we can keep this kid safe. So we can have compassion, and we can also take steps to encourage a safer environment. This next one is a really difficult one that we get often. My student can't be suicidal. They know God, or they have a relationship with God, or they're Christian or Catholic or whatever religious statement kind of comes into play here. I'm in the middle of reading a book, and it was a really powerful, because this book is called What the Fireflies Knew, and it's written from a perspective of a 10-year-old who turns 11 in the book, but it's written from the perspective of a child. And her mom is in a hospital for mental health concerns. And she says something like, my mom taught me that even with God on your side, or something like that, you still need help from other people sometimes. So a lot of this, like, my student can't be suicidal because of their relationship with God, or God will save them, or God has a plan, those types of things. It can be really helpful to remind families that, yes, it is totally okay for your faith to be important to you. And we can really validate that. And sometimes we need help from other people, or sometimes there needs to be an extra step that comes into play so that this person can stay safe. So kind of thinking about how to play around with that message can be really helpful in these situations. And then, you know, this other thing where having a relationship with God, you know, kind of thinking about suicide as like a moral issue, or a moral issue, I'll say. It can be hard to imagine that your child is thinking about something that seems to conflict with your faith. Right now, we need to take this seriously and get them some help. So it's kind of redirecting, like it's essentially saying like that must be really difficult. And and I would encourage you to process that later because right now the most important thing is your child's safety. So kind of redirecting that dilemma as it comes up it's really tough, but it's really important as well. So once we kind of can join with parents and use that compassion and validation to get some buy-in around, okay, let's think about safety at home. We do want to go ahead and look at step number 6, which is make the environment safe. So we want to obviously one part of this is firearm safety, but there's a lot more to making the environment safe than just thinking about firearms. So we want to ask, like, we always want to do safety planning around firearms, but we also want to consider what does this student have a plan for suicide, and if so, or do they have a method in mind for suicide, and if so, what is it? So we can safety plan around that method. So if we need to safety plan around sharps, if we need to safety plan around I don't know, suffocation things, whatever that looks like, medication, whatever that looks like, we want to make sure that we're considering those things and taking some steps to safety plan. And when we're creating this plan, we want to make sure that we're like explicitly talking about who is going to do what and by when. So we want to make sure that we're documenting that as well. Mom is responsible for locking up all medications by tonight, by 6 p.m. I don't know, whatever time, I don't know, however you want to say that. And then we're going to follow up with that person, with mom, and we're going to ask, hey, were you able to get this done? We're going to do that the next day, hopefully. So that's one example. Dad is responsible for making sure that all of the firearms in the home are in a gun safe that is locked. And we want to make that happen by the end of the day today. Those steps might need to be adjusted as we go along, and that's why follow-up is so important, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But we want to make, like I said, we want to think about what means were included in the plan, and then who is going to address those means so that we can reduce access, and who's going to be responsible for doing that and by when. And then we also want to think about, like, how can we empower the student to take control over their environment without interacting with lethal means. And so a lot of ways that can look are thinking about some of the things that Melissa had mentioned earlier about the environment. So do we need to adjust the lighting? Are overhead lights overstimulating? And we need to just do lamps or natural lighting? Do we need to adjust temperature? Kind of thinking about the 5 senses and how we can work to, I guess, placate those senses or make them feel good. So we might want soft textures around. We might want blankets and stuff for warmth. We might want different lighting. We might want to think about, is the TV too loud while other people are talking? And so do we need to decrease the volume of the TV or turn it off completely? What kinds of things would a person need? Is it really messy and that's overwhelming to me? Can we clean up a little bit so that it feels more tidy and that makes us feel calm? Kind of thinking about being able to empower the student to take control over their environment in that way, because we would really rather them not interact with lethal means at all. That's where the parents step in and take charge of the safety plan. So those are my thoughts about making the environment safe. I realize that there's another handout if you feel like you need more information about talking specifically about firearms or medications or other environmental safety things with parents. I would highly recommend participating in a CALM training, which is called Counseling on Access to Lethal Means. That's a training that we provide in-house, but you can also find it online for free. So I have a couple of handouts, at least one handout that kind of covers some of the, I guess, guidelines or recommendations for how you can help families problem solve firearm safety and medication safety in their home. Melissa, you have your hand raised.
Thank you for acknowledging my quiet hand. It was very quiet.
It was.
So I'm curious how you might respond. And I've absolutely been a part of these kinds of conversations, but if someone heard this kind of content and were to respond and say, this is too much, you're just playing into it. And how you might respond to that concern or that challenge.
Yeah, that's really, I think I would probably, honestly, I would be put off. And so I would probably kind of stall a little bit. And I would say okay, can you tell me more about what you mean? So, I do that just to kind of, honestly, so that I can gather my thoughts, but also I would like for them to say things out loud so that they can hear it come out of their mouth. And then I would explain, I can see why those are concerns for you or why this is a concern for you. I know that it's really scary to have these conversations at all. And maybe it's overkill. Maybe this is us being overly cautious. Maybe we don't actually need to be super concerned about firearms because maybe your child has no intention of using a firearm. And we know because of years and years of research that these are the things that make a child the safest. And my job is to do whatever I can to make your child the safest. Or to help you make your child the safest. And I know that your child's safety is really important to you. So being able to kind of remind them that their child's safety is really important to them. And also kind of, be assertive and say, these are the things that we know are the most protective. And it's okay for us to be overly cautious. What I can also tell you is that we are not going to play into a person's suicidality. They either have it or they don't. And for them, it looks how it looks, right? Or it sounds how it sounds. And so us reacting is ultimately going to make them feel seen and heard and taken seriously, and probably is automatically going to decrease their risk of suicide as opposed to increase it. So I would kind of just have that conversation. I tend to talk in circles in general, if you all haven't noticed. So I think I could probably say all of that in multiple ways. Does that answer your question, or is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's super consistent with how I've tried to frame it. I've probably tried different things and had varying levels of success. I love the tell me more strategy. That's probably one of my absolute go-tos, no matter what is happening. If someone says something and I really don't know what to say back, either they've said something that I didn't expect, or I'm really tired, whatever the thing is, just tell me more. And getting the person to talk more gives you time to make a plan, and also gives you more information if they'll tell you more. But no, I think what you said is absolutely correct. I find that folks say that with this, and also non-suicidal self-injury, and I'm not trying to muddy the waters here, but this play into it, as framing this as attention-seeking kinds of behavior, and so that's kind of a common concern, especially when we start talking about like, oh, well, you're just trying, turn the lights down and make it really nice and calm. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're just playing into it. And exactly what you said, that, we're all on the same team here, and it's team keeping your child safe and
Yep.
and redirecting it in that way. I love it.
I also have this just came to my mind. I've had a lot of success being able to explain to parents. I don't know why this is so successful, but it's something to think about. Being able to explain to parents that it's not their child's fault that their brain works the way it does. And just kind of talking about neurobiology and how their brain is just not fully developed. And so their ability to regulate their emotion, maybe they seem dramatic to us, but their feelings are as big as they say they are. And that has everything to do with like science and brain development, and nothing to do with like intentional attention seeking behavior most of the time. And I also with attention seeking stuff, I also will always say, maybe your child is doing something for attention. Maybe this is an attention seeking behavior. I know that when someone is doing something to get attention, it's probably because they need attention. So it's really important that we pay attention to this and that we address this in a way that is prioritizing their safety. Because if we can, and kind of like we talked about last week, if we consistently take this seriously, this behavior is either going to continue when it needs to, because this child is going to know that if I ask for help, I'm going to receive it, or this behavior is going to stop because this child is going to know if I ask for help, I'm going to receive it. So does that make sense? So being able to also reiterate that to parents can be really helpful. Let's go to the next slide. I don't actually remember. Oh, following up. I don't know what follow-up can logistically look like in your school setting. And I recommend that follow-up happens on some level. It's really essential. Checking in with the student before or upon their return to school. So if if they did have to go to the hospital, or at least got a screening to see whether or not they would be admitted into a hospital, we want to make sure that if they left school for suicidality, that when they come back to school, we're checking in with them. Or if we had a conversation about suicide the next day, we're checking in with them. We want to make sure that we're continuing to assess their suicide risk. We want to pay attention to House Bill 2567 and the nuances of that and what that looks like in your school district. Again, the only formal guidance we've been able to receive on that is for everyone to have your school district contact your school district's legal team for interpretation. So it's important to kind of know how your school district is interpreting this law and what it means for suicide intervention in your school, and what it means for working with parents and students. And then, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes we're going to come up with safety plans that don't work. Sometimes we're going to come up with safety plans that we try and we realize, doesn't do it for me. And that is totally okay. When that happens, we just want to make sure that we're adjusting that plan. So that would look like checking with the student to say, hey, this 4x4x4 breathing technique, have you tried it? Yes, I've tried it. It didn't really work for me. Okay. Is there something that we can replace it with? So we can trust students if they say that doesn't work for me. We might want to go ahead and like explore, does it work for you ever? Are there times that it works for you and times that it doesn't? Because we know that coping mechanisms aren't going to work the same every single time. It just kind of depends on what's going on. So it might be something worth keeping on the safety plan and not totally taking off, but there might be things on there that are like, that's not going to work for me. We'll go ahead and take it off, and that's fine. And then when we think about the environmental safety factors, we want to make sure that we are adjusting the safety plan when we're checking in, like, hey, this was the plan. You were supposed to do this thing by this time. Is that finished? No, it's not finished. Okay, what can we do? What was the barrier to that? What can we do to get that done? And let's adjust the timeline. Or does somebody else need to take this task? Kind of thinking, there just might be some ongoing problem solving that needs to take place when it comes to reducing access to means or thinking about lethal means safety. So adjusting a safety plan is totally normal, and I highly encourage it. I feel like we've talked about several different scenarios. We were talking last week, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. We were talking last week about working with parents who just aren't taking the risk as seriously or are hesitant to take safety precautions. And I feel like we've kind of covered the approach to this by looking at the other scenarios from today. But are there any specific questions or lingering questions from last week that you all want to make sure that we address in the time that we have left?
So one thing that I wanted to ask you guys about was me and my counselor, we were talking about, so I'm the school nurse at Kingman Middle High School, sorry. We were talking about how we talk about this and we want people to take it seriously, but I feel like we talk about it so much that people aren't taking it as seriously as they should. Like, it's just another thing that people are talking about. And then from like working in the PICU, the 2018, 2019 suicide attempt versus the 2020, 2021 suicide attempt rate almost tripled in our unit. Like, it was an insane amount. So it is very serious.
Mm-hmm.
How do we talk to parents, families, other people in the school in a way that they will take this seriously?
It's a really hard question. And it can make for exhausting interactions, and it can also kind of breed some hopelessness for us as the people who are responding to suicide attempts or working with the students who are struggling. I wish that there was an easy answer to making someone, like, I wish that I could make someone take it seriously.
Yeah.
All I can do is educate them and insist that this is serious and reiterate, I believe that your child is suffering. I believe that this is serious. I believe that your child's life is at risk or their safety is at risk. Being able to say those things very directly, very explicitly, is what we can do. You can also say things like, I want to help you take this seriously. How can I support you in creating safety for your child? How can I support you in understanding what your child is going through? Are there missing links, right? Like, what is happening? What are the barriers? We might be able to explore what those barriers are for why this isn't being taken seriously. And at the end of the day, we can't force someone to take it seriously. So all we can do is what we can do. It is hard to be direct and explicit about suicide safety or suicide risk, especially when we're working with parents, because it is uncomfortable to tell a parent how to be a parent. That's not a thing that feels good for anyone. And so it's, we have to be, I guess, courageous enough to be authentic and to say, these are my concerns, and I don't want to avoid this conflict. I want to take this head on with you. I want to join with you in that. And if they're not willing to do that, I don't know what more you can do. I wish that I could. I think that in some cases, if we're thinking about like neglect, like emotional neglect, it could be potentially reportable. but I don't know how successful, I guess, that action is. I don't have a lot of information about, and also making those reports takes some time. So, and so the response to those reports, it's not like immediate. So I mean, that's the only other thing that I can think of. Melissa, do you have anything that you would say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, this is a very common concern. I think that when we're talking about suicide and other really high risk, really scary kinds of topics, that folks tend to like be pretty polarized in terms of their response. Either they take it so seriously and get so emotional that their brains shut off, or they don't take it seriously at all and their brains are shut off, right? And so like we're trying to find that middle spot, and we, as much as possible, want to try to plan ahead, practice ahead, so that we're not having to do anything for the first time in the moment with someone who's actually struggling, right? And so one of the strategies that I've used, it is one thing to say, like, to sit in a PD and to nod along while someone says, you need to ask someone directly, are you thinking about killing yourself? And everybody can nod along. It is very different to turn to the person next to you, look them in the eyes, and say it out loud to them. It's a different experience. For some people, that's way too much. We used to recommend, like, go and look at yourself in the mirror and say it out loud and practice saying it out loud. And I think the same can be true for the lethal means conversation.
Yes.
We can all nod along and say, yep, we're going to ask that parent or that guardian about firearm safety. And it is awful. It feels awful in the moment. Everybody feels awful. So practicing it out loud also makes it real and is going to evoke in our brains all of those human icky responses, and it's going to make it really real. And so if someone is not taking it seriously and they can actually sit and ask another human, are you thinking about killing yourself? They know how to respond. They feel okay talking about lethal means, then okay, like we have a plan, we're all set, right? I've never been in a school where every grown-up is in that space, ever, because it's such an awful, awful thing. And so doing the actual practice, I found is helpful in terms of getting folks over that kind of denial hump, is kind of part of how I see it.
And we can think about that too, like, as for me, I finally have gotten to a place where I was able to have a conversation with my husband and say, hey, we're having a child. I have a 3-month-old now. We're having a child. We should probably think about safely storing our medications instead of just throwing them in a closet, right? And so even being able to practice those things in your own homes for the first time can take some of the pressure off and can be a good place to start. So I don't know, just kind of some food for thought there, thinking about what are some ways that you practice environmental safety in your own home, and then being able to do that kind of practice over and over again with the people in your life. I wish there was an easier answer. Or
this isn't an easy topic, so,
No.
like, so we just do what we got to do.
Yeah. Again, taking an informative educational approach with parents while also balancing that compassion and validation is going to be the most effective thing. Youth are likely to know if their household has firearms and where they're located. We always say youth know where the Christmas presents are, where the booze are, and where the guns are. They know a lot of stuff that parents don't want to believe that they know. So we kind of want to just assume that they probably know. We don't want to not assume to a point where we don't ask the question, but we want to make sure that we are asking, because we're not going to like put an idea into their head. And then, yeah, safety planning is a brief intervention.
Well, I want to thank everyone today. We have 1 minute left. Just want to remind you that our last session will be next week on October 25th. And we'll be talking quite a bit about hospitalization, post-hospitalization. We know that hospitalization back to the community and especially back into school is an important topic. And we will be having some representatives from MARILAC to talk a little bit about hospitalization. And we will take some time. So hopefully if you have questions about hospitalization that that you've always wanted answered or areas that you think would be helpful to hear about. We will be kind of doing a question and answer format next week. So please think about the types of questions. We know that hospitalization, especially from the school perspective, often the lack of communication, not kind of knowing, sort of the classic story is the kid was gone. We know they were hospitalized. We know, and all of a sudden they show up at school, and even how to support and how to coordinate from hospitalization back into school and the community are important areas. So thanks so much for attending. We'll see you next week. And thank you, Erica, for another amazing presentation.